Hello there, everybody. Welcome to my little humble channel here on the YouTube and on Rumble. And today I have the pleasure of welcoming Professor Glenn Diesen out of Norway right now. Can you introduce yourself to my viewers a little bit? I think they're familiar with your name and so forth, but what do you do?
Sure. My name is Glenn Diesen. I'm a professor at the University of Southeastern Norway. My main research focus, initially it was the post-Cold War security architecture in Europe. So what it meant to organize Europe around NATO and EU, both of which attempt to include all of Europe eventually, except for the largest country in Europe, which is Russia, and the implications this has for security. After 2014, I began to look more at the political economy of Russia reorganizing itself towards the east. So the economic connectivity, everything from the technologies to energy, agriculture, transportation corridors, banking, payment systems, switching to national currencies, this kind of development. So this is my main focus. I worked for most of my time. I was teaching in Australia, then I was working for a few years in Moscow, and now I'm teaching here in Norway.
Okay, that about sums it up. Speaking about economy and things like that, I heard some pretty, I guess, believable information from Turkey that Turkey, being a NATO nation, has applied for membership in the BRICS association. Have you heard anything about that?
Yeah, no, they they are applying. So one there's some different viewpoints on this in terms of what they want to achieve. Some assume that they're just putting pressure on the EU, so they will essentially show that they have alternatives.
Yeah.
I tend to see it slightly different. I don't. I think we often tend to see it as Turkey trying to belong in one bloc or the other bloc. But it's important that we shouldn't compare these two blocks because it's not two blocks. The NATO is a military alliance in which, by definition, country A and B cooperate for collective advantage against country C, so against the non-members. This is the nature of an alliance. Meanwhile, BRICS, they're not an alliance in this sense. They're not the main objective is not to pursue security against non-members. It's pursuing security with members, and you see this in the makeup, which is why in BRICS Plus now you have both China and India, you have Saudi Arabia and Iran, you have Egypt and Ethiopia. Like none of these countries get along that very well. So the main objective is not no one could think that India and China is going to ally up against the United States. On the contrary, I think they're looking for ways to improve economic ties, but also use the economic connectivity as a way to promoting or creating incentives to resolving political differences. So I think
Right.
this is the main difference. And for Turkey, I think it would be ideal because the worst thing we want is to end up with bloc politics, where one bloc versus the other. Now, if you have countries like Turkey who ends up a NATO member and a BRICS member, I think having some overlap could be positive. So everything doesn't become us versus them. One side lose if the other side gains. So usually when we talk about integration, it's often promoted an idea referred to as the Olympic rings, where each block essentially go a little bit into each other. I think this would be a much more positive way of creating an international system, which is less zero sum. On the other hand, the counter argument is simply that the Turkish are simply trying to increase their own market value for the Europeans. So, but those are the general assessments people take.
Well, Turkey has been knocking on the for a European Union membership for a long time, but they've never been accepted so far. I guess in 20 years, they've been on the application list for the European Union.
But what the Turks always point out, though, is that they would like to diversify their economic ties simply because that's what is required if you want to be an independent pole of power in the international system. And so even if you look at countries which are already EU members, such as Hungary, they're both EU and NATO, and nonetheless, they're very eager terms of reaching out east to China, Russia, but also, of course, strengthening with the United States. So they don't want to belong to an exclusive bloc, because once you choose one side over the other, you lose your value to both sides, because
Right.
now you're essentially trapped. So the main objective is, again, I go every now and then to the Hungarian central bank, and I also make the same argument. It's good to be in the EU. They can use collective bargaining power to get better deals with the Russians, Chinese, and Americans. But within the EU, the Germans and others will put a great pressure on them. So it's always good to be able to lean other ways towards other countries as well, if the Germans get too overbearing. so,
Yeah.
so this is my argument of how they can strengthen their own position. So, and this is what the Turks are doing as well. They want to have an independent voice in the international system and get along with all the main centers of power, which I think is a very reasonable position. So they should not fear, they should avoid this pressure to essentially join one bloc, which is dependent, and the whole power structure dependent on going against external powers.
Right. Yeah, so it seems like a smart move then, really, from the Turks. All right. Then I guess there wouldn't be any conflict being NATO member and being a member in BRICS or any other economic coalition, so to speak.
Well, it would for NATO, because the nature of a military alliance is internal solidarity versus external adversaries. So if you look at the United States, when it leads a military alliance, what does it mean? Well, you divide the world either us or them. So, and then, the world becomes divided between dependent allies versus weakened adversaries, which is why having a bit of conflict between the Europeans or between the Germans and the Russians is a good thing to some extent, because then you get to weaken the Russians, but also you get full loyalty from the Germans. The same in the Middle East, which is why it's problematic if the Chinese are able to negotiate too much of a peace between the Arabs in Iran, because suddenly they lose an important ally to weaken Iran. Meanwhile, the Arabs become less obedient, which we're already seeing. The same applies to Asia. Whenever the Chinese and the Indians have a bit of a spat, then you see a little bit of celebration in the American media, like New York Times, where they essentially say, well, now India should, forego this ambition of being so independent and instead ally under American lines to contain China. So,
Yeah.
so NATO is not happy if Turkey shows too much independence and begin to pursue its own interest independently from the bloc. And this is where the main pressure would come from.
Very, very good analysis. Another question is or an issue is, of course, the war going on in the Ukraine. And I read this today, actually, that the European Union, or France, rather, wants to freeze the Russian assets in Western Europe and use them for military aid to Zelensky's regime, to Ukraine. I mean, they've already supplied so much money and so much weapons and all that. And of course, Putin's response, if there would be a freeze on Russian assets in Western Europe and then sent to Ukraine, is going to infuriate him, or he's already had. What's your take on that?
Yeah, it's well, the EU has changed fundamentally. Again, when I was a student 20 plus years, the main argument the EU was this completely different kind of power. It was an ethical power, it was a normative power, civilian power, and the EU always had the same goal, or the same recommendation whenever there's conflict around the world, like start talking, always have diplomacy, even if you don't agree, at least try negotiations. But look, in this conflict, what we're doing instead, it's the reluctance to have any diplomacy. No one can sit down and talk to the Russians. Negotiation is rejected. We have to have a military solution, even if it's quite obvious we cannot win this militarily. And keep in mind, the Hungary even tried to start negotiations between, Orban went to both, to Kiev, Moscow, as well as Beijing, trying to start talks, at least sit down and talk. And the EU responded by punishing him, because we do not do not promote the diplomacy. So the EU has really changed fundamentally, and now, of course, not only seeking military solutions, but as the EU is running, economies are not doing well. Now they have essentially legalized theft in terms of stealing the sovereign funds of Russia
Yeah.
and sending it to Ukraine to try to prolong the war. Now, you can make a moral argument why seizing money of Russia and giving to Ukraine would be a moral thing to do. But of course, imagine if every country did this. If India, China began to seize American assets and give them to Iraq, or seize German assets and give them to Serbia, the world would be a mess. You don't do this. This legalization of theft is very, very problematic. And it also is another way for the EU to dig in and reject essentially any solutions to this. So it's quite extraordinary. And beyond this, it's not just between the West and Russia. You have to see the rest of the world, how they're seeing this. Because from their perspective, they're seeing that the West isn't able to compete that much economically anymore. So they're going this economic war against the Chinese. Very obvious now. It's nothing to do with values. It's in order to roll back their technological development. They're looking at Russia, where they refuse to have basic diplomacy negotiations, instead legalizing theft. All this more and more aggressive economic coercion around the world. And what do? Even friends like India is now trying to integrate further into BRICS, because they realize that it can't live in a system where the West gets to dictate all its foreign policy, dictate its economic relations. So yes, they look to BRICS. They want to have their own technological partnership. They want to have their own payment systems, their own use of currencies, transportation corridors, all of this which isn't vulnerable to Western sanctions. So the whole world is learning to live without us because we're acting so irrational. But it's impossible to have that discussion here in Europe, because they're so convinced in their own virtue that if you make the simple argument, it's not in our interest to legalize theft, the rest of the world will shun us. You can't make that argument, because they're so convinced that they are on the right side of history.
Exactly. Well, yeah, very, very nicely put. Another thing that happened just this week, past week, was the assembly of NATO top leaders at the American base in Ramstein, southwestern Germany. I listened to both the Zelensky plead, and I listened to Lloyd Austin. The Swedish Defense Minister Paul Jonsson was there. I didn't see any of his speeches at all. I guess they don't consider him a heavy factor. But Lloyd Austin's speech, for me, was a little bit uncertain around the request from Zelensky and Ukraine for long distance permission to fire long distance missiles into Russian territory. He basically said, yeah, maybe you can do that. We don't really know, in my opinion. I don't know if you have another take, but Zelensky's argument was quite astonishing to me. He says, I need long distance permission to fire Storm Shadows or Tomahawks or whatever he's got far into Russian territory to make Russia come to the peace table. Okay? I just can't see that logic. Can you?
No, it makes no sense. Indeed, I think that would make the Russians less likely to negotiate. And again, but two things they pursued in Ramstein was one, they wanted more weapons, obviously, and the second was, of course, as you mentioned, this approval for long-range strikes. I think it was a big mistake for the Ukrainians to invade Kursk. They tend to use this to point to it as saying, listen, look, the Russians aren't doing anything. We can cross the red lines, and they're not even retaliating. Surely, now we can do whatever we want. But the problem there is, of course, we don't recognize whenever Russia retaliates, we pretend as if it's in a vacuum. So now, Russia's have a very powerful bombing campaign. But if you read the Western media, it came out of nowhere. It's just Putin being a barbaric beast. But this is a direct response to the invasion of Kursk, which seemingly one very definitely had some American support in terms of providing intelligence. So we stepped over the red lines. They are retaliating now, and so I think a bunch of it is based on a very false premise. But for the Russians, they don't care much anymore what the West thinks of them because they're learning now by disconnecting economically to live without the West. Who they do care about though is the Chinese, the Indians, and their new friends. From their perspective, they would like to get an end to the war. But after the Ukrainians invaded Russian territory, seemingly with NATO support, no one's knocking on Moscow's door anymore. Now there's more understanding actually for Moscow to not sit down and make huge concessions. But also has to be pointed out that since the beginning of this war, the Russians they did try to negotiate, and we learned that in Istanbul, as everyone, like the Ukrainian side, the mediators, everyone have argued the Russians were willing to compromise on everything except for neutrality. They refused to have NATO in Ukraine. This is the red line. It has to be respected. And it was the Americans and the British who sabotaged the peace negotiations, which is also recognized. But
wasn't that agreement also already signed by the Ukraine?
No, they initialed some things, but they hadn't been signed yet. But this is the fallacy. Also, in Ukraine, they passed a law initiated by Zelensky that made it illegal to negotiate with the Russians, and it was the NATO country who explicitly said we're not going to have any diplomacy with the Russians. We're not going to forget about negotiations, even basic diplomacy. We're not going to sit down and talk to them. Again, it's the EU which are punishing Hungary for trying to even have diplomacy. So it doesn't make any sense. But again, here in Europe, you're not allowed to say that does make sense, because if you say, well, the Russians have been open for negotiations, it's the West who rejected. Now it sounds like you're taking the side of the Russians, irrespective of objective reality, and you have to support your own. That's only logic. You have to show you're sitting in our trenches and not there. So it's very silly, but also. This whole idea, I think the Americans are a bit cautious. Of course, Zelensky would like to have weapons and permission to bomb Moscow. But this is the Russians have reached now the end of the line. We can't escalate more without them retaliating. It's simply becoming irresponsible for them not to try to build up their deterrent. But I think the Americans often look to the Europeans. They've always done this. So either let the Europeans first send their tanks and then see what happens, and then the Americans come after. And I think it's often like this with the British as well. They're a bit like the bulldog who wants to show that they're still relevant. So the Americans let them kick in the door with effectively a new escalation. And then if the Russians don't do anything, retaliate, then the Americans can follow. But that's why it's a huge pressure on Russia now as well. If any of these long-range weapons begin to strike deep inside Russia, bombing Moscow or something, then it has to be a very fierce response. Otherwise, they're going to signal that, okay, this is another red line which you're allowed to step over. So we're reaching a very, very dangerous stage, especially as we're losing the war in Ukraine now, which means we either has to start talking to the Russians or escalate towards a possible nuclear war. And given that we don't have diplomacy and we don't negotiate, it only puts escalation on the table, which is why this is so completely absurd what we're doing now.
Exactly. And only Sweden is one of the worst, in my opinion. We have not only gone into NATO, which I don't think is very significant for Sweden, but we've also signed a defense cooperation agreement, which lets up 17 large territories for American forces in the territory of Sweden, and also not any restriction as far as nuclear weapons. And by question from the media to the Swedish defense minister, he said, well, it's not necessary to have an exemption for nuclear weapons placed on Swedish soil, which is quite remarkable, in my opinion. Um, then, I mean, the European Union, I don't understand their position really about sending a lot of money and a lot of resources to fight for Ukraine when you can ask the question, who wins? I mean, Great Britain has a defense industry. They have their Storm Shadows and other weapon systems that are useful against Russia. Sweden is the other country that has its own defense industry with Saab and Bofors and so forth. The Ericsson systems, they're suppliers to Raytheon and to Boeing and stuff like that. But the rest, Germany doesn't. Yeah, they have Rheinmetall that makes armored vehicles and steel, but who has anything to gain? I can't get my head around it. What do you say?
No, I think it's again the Scandinavian countries, including Sweden, of course, are making themselves into a front line, and it's um, no, it's I don't think people appreciate how horrific this can become because uh, keep in mind that. Well, just take a step back. If you want to look at the main security challenges for Russia for the past 800 years, has been the unreliable access to international waters. These are the
Yeah,
arteries of trade and all. Now, the Russians had three waters on its west now. It has the Arctic, it has the Baltic Sea, and has the Black Sea. Now, back in the 13th century, when Kievan Rus collapsed, which was the old Russia, if you will, it lost all access to these things, and this impacted its security because you can't transport troops around. Also, it gave it a very backward economy. So, and at this time, the ones who were limiting their access to the oceans was one of the great powers then, which was Sweden.
mm-hmm.
They're the one who could occupy Russia. They're the one who blocked their access to the seas. All of this ended 300 years ago with the Great Northern War, which ended in 1721.
Mm-hmm.
Now, since then, this is when it's all usually recognized that Sweden ceased being a great power while Russia became one. That's when they recognized it became a European power, they became a great power, a maritime power. Uh, and since then they had all of this was largely dependent on having reliable access. Now, since then, what we're seeing now is to some extent a reversal. When of course now it's the British and the Americans who for the past 300 years tried to block Russia's access to waters. But now with Sweden joining NATO, as well as Finland, by the way, we see a lot of these efforts now to recontain or roll back the last 300 years. And I don't think it's hyperbolic because if you listen to the former NATO Secretary General Anders Fogh Rasmussen, Danish, by the way, he was celebrating, saying that now that NATO will include Finland and Sweden, we can put a block again on Russia through St. Petersburg, so we can block them in the Baltic Sea. And even have Financial Times writing about this, that, now we have sanctions on them. The Danes and all should prevent Russian oil tankers from sailing freely through the Baltic Sea. You're having NATO officers giving interviews saying that Kaliningrad, this little enclave of Russia, now that we have Sweden and Finland, we can put a complete control on the Baltic Sea. Now Kaliningrad is surrounded. This region, we can make it very painful and problematic for the Russians. This is the way we're talking now. And look up in media and political statements from leaders in the Baltic states or Poland. They're just calling, this is NATO scene now. We should restrict and not let the Russians sail here. So we're the context here of trying to cut off Russia's access to the sea, because this is what we're doing, and this was the purpose in the Black Sea as well with the
Crimea.
Redoing the Crimean War of the 1850s, doing it again, kicking them out. Then at that time, the European politicians were quite explicit. The purpose of the Crimean War was then to push them out of Europe and into Asia by disconnecting them from the Black Sea. These days, of course, we have to speak in code, so it's all democracy and freedom, but nothing has changed. So we're doing this in the Black Sea, we're doing this in the Baltic Sea, but also in the Arctic. The Americans are now opening military bases in Finland, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, and in our countries we're not allowed to call these military bases because it's seen as, oh, we don't want to seem aggressive. We call them designated territories. America
Okay.
controls them. It's for their military. They have jurisdiction over them. So effectively, the perfect description of military base, but we shouldn't call them one because we don't technically have foreign bases on our soil. And we say, oh, it's not aimed against Russia in the Arctic. But then you look up the American media, listen to their politicians, say, yeah, these are military bases. And yes, this will give America great punching power up in the Arctic to confront the Russians.
Yeah.
And now I'm seeing all these talks in Sweden, as are Finland, where they're saying northern part Lapland. Oh, so Putin might take our territory there one day.
Oh, yeah.
No, that makes no sense at all. The only sense that makes is if you want to militarize the north of Finland because that's close to the Russian northern fleet on the Arctic. So
Yeah.
we're all talking defense, but this is a huge offense by NATO, doing huge steps towards creating a northern flank against the Russians. But
Yeah.
again, we're not allowed to discuss this either because then if we say that NATO's the aggressor in the north, then you're taking the sides of the Russians,
Yeah.
irrespective of reality and irrespective of it being in
Mm.
our interest or not. So it's a very crazy situation we put ourselves in.
I've been called a Russian troll many times on X, for example, where I'm very active, by the way. But the North, like you're saying, I'm very familiar with it, but because I hail from the north of Sweden originally, and the S-range base in Kiruna and down to the air base in Vidsel is now a very, very large interest area for NATO and the United States because it's a center since many years back on satellite technology and trying to get surveillance of the whole northern hemisphere, the north tip, which includes the Arctic, of course, and Murmansk is very its proximity to Finland is 200 miles or something like that. But I want to talk to you about another thing. When you're talking about landlocking Russia, or blocking their access to the various seas, they have the Pacific Ocean, they have the Arctic, they have right now the Black Sea, and in some sense the Baltic Sea. I'm publishing an article in the next couple of days where I deep dived into the plans of NATO to mine the Baltic Sea in the idea of that Russia has St. Petersburg, they have Kaliningrad, so right now they have access to the Baltic Sea. And then, of course, you have Öresund, which is Danish, Swedish territory, which is easy to block. But they're talking about mining the entire Baltic Sea in the idea of preventing Russian transportation by sea, military and civilian. Have you heard anything about that plan? It's an article that's coming out. I wrote it because I got inside information of the plans from NATO to do this. And I'm a trained UDT, which is underwater demolition troops, in my military career in the Navy in Sweden. And we found and destroyed tons of leftover mines from World War II. The whole area of Skagerrak, Kattegat, Öresund, southern Baltic Sea between Öland and Gotland was absolutely infested with mines. And many of those were laid out without any plotting of where they exactly were. So this was a menace and a problem long after World War II ended. I just started my service in 1978. And we still found mines all over the coast, mostly unharmful because they were rusted and inactive, but still we had to destroy them. And that was a big operation. Are they insane? Start mining the Baltic Sea? What?
Well, I really, really hope this is a rumor and not the actual case, because this would be just that would be devastating. But again, one should also be too careful assuming that common sense will prevail, because there is a huge push towards this escalating with Russia, and I made the point as well that for anyone who's skeptical or always, clinging to a counter argument, I like to present the case of Nord Stream
Yeah.
because here there can't be any more discussion here because well, look what happened after it was blown up. I think most people recognize or that it was the United States, but the United States tried to blame the Ukrainians for it, which is fair enough. Let's
Hmm.
accept that narrative that it was the Ukrainians. Again, as we read in the Wall Street Journal, Zelensky ordered it,
Yeah.
and the Americans tried to stop him, but it was too late. Well, either way, this is at least an admission then that the Americans knew of the attack before it happened. Well, what did they do after the attack? They blamed Russia. They point to Russia, say all evidence point towards Russia. This was Russia's fault. But not only did they lie to their own public in the wider world, they used this as a reason to militarize further the Baltic Sea and escalate the war in Ukraine with heavier weapons, more weapons, and uh, and again more NATO activity, not just in the Baltic Sea, but in general along all seas to protect the infrastructure. We used to call this false flag operations. What is? I'm curious. What exactly is the counter argument there? If the Americans have the NATO used this attack as a reason to militarize the Baltic states and escalate the war in Ukraine, and now we're saying, oh yeah, we knew all along it wasn't the Russians, but we lied anyways, and this is how we used to lie. What is I don't understand what the counter argument would be. But however, like again, back to the same point, no journalist or no politicians can touch it because if you're saying, well, obviously we did this and then we lied to our public in order to escalate the war and militarize the Baltic, then you're seen as now you're supporting Russia and you're not supporting us. So,
Yeah.
so you can't. Again, it's not in our interest. It's obviously true this, but yet you can't say it because you have to pick your own side. Otherwise, you're a Putinist.
Yeah.
It's just such a ridiculous propagandist environment at the moment. So it's
Yeah.
yeah.
There's a couple of things about the Nord Stream attack. On my channel, we've done several stories and facts about it. And it started with when Sweden was not even a member of NATO. They had a Baltops exercise in 2022. Whereas in June of 2022, we recorded American war vessels in this exact area on several locations, and also in the aftermath of the actual explosion. The Swedish diving vessel Belos, which is one of the more sophisticated pieces of equipment that the Swedish Navy has, had made at least 14, 15 trips out to the area where the explosions occurred. And the rumor, which I have not been able to prove, is that that was a cleanup operation to make sure that if any other independent a unit would investigate the bottom where the explosions happened and try to just hide what actually happened. And for me, being a military diver as a career, the rumor that it was some Ukrainians on a sailboat doing this, I mean, that's so laughable. I mean, 80 meters of depth in dark and current waters. You need a geostationary diving base. You need a clock. You need a decompression chamber for the diver's safety. And those depths cannot be operated from a sailing boat. That's so ridiculous. Or what do you think?
Well, no, I think obviously it was ridiculous, but it was also obvious, when the Russians asked for an independent investigation from the United Nations and all the Western countries put down a no.
Yeah.
I think it was quite obvious as well. But also imagine for the Germans now, they know that the Americans did it. The Americans blaming the Ukrainians, which might have had a role. The Czech, when they heard that the Americans said that, Zelensky behind this, the Czechs are saying, well, it was a legitimate target, destroying Germany's critical energy infrastructure. They asked the Poles, can you please arrest these Ukrainians, which the Americans pointed out, and they let them leave. And the Polish prime minister said, well, you should apologize for having built the pipelines and you should be quiet. This is how the Germans are treated by their own. But I just wanted to add with Sweden as well, because they have been they have been for a long time attempted to be pulled into NATO,
Yeah.
which is why you need some conflicts every now and then. That goes back to my previous argument about the problem of military alliances. It's deeply problematic when peace breaks out, because if you have too much peace, then you can't contain the rival power, and your allies are not obedient anymore. And in the 1980s, you had the Swedish Prime Minister Olof Palme. He was trying to promote better neighborly relations with the Soviets, and
Yeah.
not to switch your sides or anything, but just have peaceful borders and good neighborly relations. Again, for the Americans, this oh no, peace is breaking out. They're trying to have more. And if they get along well, it's a bit like they did with the Japanese in '56. They threatened, well, if you solve their border issue with the Soviets, then we're going to take Okinawa from you. So, you don't want to resolve the conflicts, because then the whole alliance system begins to fragment. So there's a great Swedish scholar in Norway, Ola Thunander. He researched all this submarine stuff, and he's written books about it as well. And more specifically, in 1982, there was there was all these stories about Soviet submarines coming into the Swedish waters, threatening Sweden.
Yeah.
And in the studies of this Thunander, he's pointing out this, that they were never there. This was the Americans and the British, and this very well cited, all his work.
Oh yeah.
And but again, what consequence did it have? Oh well, all the peaceful initiatives by the Swedish government had to be scaled back. The Swedish government became much more critical of the Soviet Union. And if you fear the Soviet Union, who do you have to start to snuggle up against and crawl under the wing? Well, you have to go to the United States,
Yeah.
and subordinate yourself a little bit. Again, people treat this like it would be a conspiracy theory. This is always how military alliances work. You can't have your puppets or your vassals getting too peaceful with your main adversary. It doesn't work this way. So, it's just also with Nord Stream, when you already exposed the lie that it wasn't the Russians, we knew all along it wasn't them, and then still we lied about it in order to escalate tensions. It's ridiculous. It's it is so obvious what has been done. Yet you have to be quiet, otherwise you're a Putinist, and
Right.
will shame you. So
Exactly. Yeah, that's the general situation.
And people fall for it. That's why they think that the patriotic thing is to subordinate ourselves completely to Washington. Even the Germans, even as the Americans are blowing up their infrastructure,
Yeah.
as the German economies, industries, especially the energy-intensive industries, can no longer compete. Now Volvo have to close down their factories.
Yep.
The country's going down the toilet. They know the Americans did this to them, and what do? They still have to bow and subordinate themselves. And if you don't do it, then you're the traitor. You're the Putin-värster and sellout. But the people who are subordinating themselves, allowing not just their own country, but Europe to go into irrelevance, to go from a subject to an object of security. This is the patriotic thing to do. I mean, I'm completely lost. It's just the only thing they say is you have to choose America or Russia. But this is a very stupid dilemma to be given. And no one else around the world is falling for this. The Indians are doing it. They say, are you going to stand with Russia or with America or NATO? And they say, well, we're an independent country. We will look after our own interests. Thank you very much. And we can't do this in Europe. It's either subordinate yourself or you're switching blocks as if we're still in the Cold War.
Exactly. Well, I'm on the opinion personally that both Sweden and Norway could do very well without any military alliances at all. Norway is not a full member of the European Union. Congratulations to you. That is, in my opinion, the best way to treat it. I support the idea that Sweden leaves the European Union with a Swexit, and we would do quite well. We don't have the euro, which has its pros and cons, that we're not a part of the currency, the euro currency. But maybe we should end there. We've been talking for about 40 minutes. Is there anything else you'd like to say? My audience is predominantly Swedish, but I'll have this subtitled in Swedish.
Well, I think on the on the wider picture, it's worth looking at for the past decade, sorry, past centuries, what a key strategy has been. Keep in mind, I don't want to go back too far, but if in the past when you had the German, no, sorry, the British and the French, they were competing for
Yeah.
dominance by controlling the seas. How the when once the British essentially took this victory, what did the French do under Napoleon? They began building this European continental system. They were going to have all of Europe, continental Europe, united to put a blockade on the British. This was a way to come
Hmm.
defeat them. Ever since those days, and even before, the British foreign policy was effectively formed by one idea: just prevent, keep a balance of power in Europe, keep the countries divided, because then, as long as the continental powers are divided, then Britain will be able to dominate. This is, again, not a very big secret. This is very much their official policies.
Oh yeah.
Uh, and this was also taken over with the Americans. Just prevent a group of countries from coalescing, coming together, which could form an independent pole of power, which could rival the US. Now, the biggest one you want to avoid coming together then has been the Germans and the Russians. So there's always been this incentive from the United States to maintain divisions in Europe. And this is what we did after the Cold War. I just understand how this would be in the interest of Europe. Because it was quite predictable, I would say, 30 years ago, which many did predict. If the new format for Europe meant that we're going to redivide the continent, remilitarize these dividing lines, and slowly move these dividing lines closer and closer to Russian borders, how could this possibly be a recipe for security or stability? Of course, it was going to blow up in our face one day,
Hmm.
and this is where we are now. And I don't see how this in any way is in the interest of Europe. Actually, I don't even think it's that much in the interest of the United States anymore either,
Oh
because
yeah.
this whole model was premised on the idea that Europe was the geopolitical center of the world. But now, because in the past, if we were able to, like in Crimean War, in time after, we were able to push the Russians out of Europe, they pushed into backward Asia where they will be irrelevant. Now we're trying to push the Russians out of Europe. They end up with the Chinese, with the Indians, the huge giants, as Europe becoming less relevant. This is this whole we are. I think we're doing things based on the past and not questioning it enough, because none of this makes much sense anymore. We should try to have some more political imagination and yeah, accept the fact that this war we had now, how with the Russians, why it was so unnecessary. For 30 years, there were, at least in the 1990s, the main foreign policy of the Russians was simply get as close with the West as possible, and we wouldn't take yes for an answer. Instead, we have worked very hard to make the Russians an enemy, and this is definitely very much against our own interests. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, much of the sanctions, economic sanctions on Russia, has sort of backfired back in our faces, and Russia seemed to be
Yeah,
mostly
predictably so.
unaffected. I'm sorry.
Predictably so.
Yeah,
Well,
exactly.
this was my main, as I mentioned before, this was my main research area from 2014.
Hmm.
How the Russians were reorganizing their economy to the east. They had everything they needed to diversify away from Europe. We can't diversify away from the Russians. So what
No.
do? We put sanctions. How is this going to end? Like I said, from the first day of sanctions, the Russians will be fine. This will only intensify what they've been doing for the past 8 years. I said they're going to just continue to move to the east instead for modernity and for
Mm.
development, while Europe will suffer greatly. And we lost cheap energy, we lost a huge market, uh, and everything is just virtuous. So yeah, let's close down for the Americans. Let's close down McDonald's and Starbucks. Uh, they're still there. They took over. Vkusna is now the old McDonald's. It's the same buildings. It's the same menu, except that no money is going to America. Starbucks, I think, it's Black
You
Star
have
now.
IKEA as well. It's now Russian controlled. They no money coming into Luxembourg, head company of IKEA.
Yeah, the Dutch agriculture done. All the
Mm.
pharmaceutical. Oh, great, huge market. They gave it to India and the Chinese now. So none of this is coming back. So no one asks the question, if Russia can diversify, but we cannot. How are how are these sanctions in our interest? Even if our goal should be to destroy Russia, they're growing now. They're the fourth largest economy in the world in purchasing power parity, according to the World Bank, while Europe is sinking, and Germany can't really fix any of its problems because its economic model was premised on a working relationship with the Russians. So uh, it's all ridiculous. But again, it's the same thing. If you criticize the sanctions, well, the Russians are criticizing the sanctions. The West is supporting it. So now you're taking the side of the Russians. So there can't be no sensible discussion anymore. It's just pick a side and read from the script. This is our slogans. Doesn't matter if it's against our interests. Doesn't matter if it's not correct. It's just it's exhausting situation to to be in Europe at this time.
Yeah, it is.
It's should book a flight to India or China or something.
Well, Russia has now offered the dissidents from the West to come without the demands of knowing the culture and the language. You can go visa free to Russia right now.
Well, maybe I should.
Or maybe we'll have
Look
to.
at that as a plan B. So
Yeah, that's escape route number AB. Yeah. Okay, Mr. Diesen, very, very pleased to have your opinion on this. I'm really happy that you could make time for this short interview, and I hope to see you in the future again sometime.
Sounds good. Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye now.